Cole Brennan had been working his West Texas ranch alone for 6 months, ever since his last hired hand left for easier work in El Paso. At 38, Cole had built a modest but sustainable cattle operation through 15 years of relentless labor, surviving droughts, economic downturns, and the isolation that drove weaker men to abandon their claims. But managing 2,000 acres and 300 head of cattle single-handedly was pushing him beyond sustainable limits. He needed help, yet good workers were scarce in this harsh borderland where the pay was low and the work brutal. The woman appeared at his ranch one scorching August morning, walking up the long, dusty road with a small bundle of belongings. Cole watched her approach from his porch, noting her purposeful stride and the way she surveyed the property with assessment rather than uncertainty. She was young, probably mid-20s, with the distinctive features and bearing of Apache people. Her simple cotton dress was worn but clean, her long black hair braided practically, and her dark eyes met his, without either deference or challenge, just direct honesty. She introduced herself as Ayasha, explaining in careful English that she'd heard he needed workers, and she could handle horses, repair fences, and work cattle. Cole hesitated, knowing that hiring an Apache woman would raise eyebrows in town. Relations between white settlers and Apache people remained tense even years after the formal end of conflicts. Apache communities lived in uneasy proximity to ranches, with mutual suspicion defining most interactions. But Cole also knew desperation when he saw it. Ayasha needed work, and he needed help. He asked why she wasn't living with her people. Ayasha's expression tightened slightly before she explained that her family had been killed during the final conflicts, that she'd spent years in a mission school learning English and domestic skills, but found herself unable to fully belong to either the Apache communities that viewed her as too assimilated or the white society that would never fully accept her. She existed in between, and she needed honest work to survive. Cole made a decision that would change both their lives. He agreed to a trial period, offering fair wages and a small room in the ranch's bunkhouse. Ayasha proved her value within days. She understood horses with an intuition that went beyond technique, calming temperamental animals and training them with patience Cole had rarely seen. She could rope competently, ride fearlessly across rough terrain, and showed no hesitation tackling difficult physical work. What impressed Cole most was her knowledge of the land itself, where to find water during dry spells, how to read weather signs, which plants indicated good grazing, and how to move through the harsh borderland efficiently. When Cole asked where she'd learned such skills, Ayasha explained simply that Apache people had lived in this territory for generations, that such knowledge was taught from childhood. She'd carried those teachings even after being separated from her community. Over the following weeks, they developed an efficient working partnership built on mutual respect and minimal conversation. Cole appreciated that Ayasha never complained about the harsh conditions, never asked for special treatment, and completed every task with quiet competence. Ayasha appreciated that Cole paid her fairly, spoke to her with basic courtesy, and judged her work rather than her background. They maintained professional distance, both aware that any appearance of impropriety would create problems neither could afford. The first test of their arrangement came when Cole needed to ride into town for supplies. Ayasha offered to accompany him to help transport goods, but Cole suggested she remain at the ranch. He explained that his neighbors already questioned his judgment in hiring her, and appearing together in town would fuel gossip neither needed. Ayasha understood immediately, nodding without offense. She was accustomed to navigating the complex social rules that governed acceptable behavior for someone in her position. After Cole left for town, Ayasha worked on repairing fence line near the ranch's eastern boundary. She noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the kind of sudden violent weather that characterized Texas summers. By the time Cole returned late that afternoon, heavy rain was already falling, turning the dry creek beds into rushing torrents. Cole found Ayesha securing the horses in the barn, efficiently preparing for the storm's full arrival. As thunder rolled across the sky and lightning illuminated the darkening landscape, they worked together to secure equipment and livestock. The storm intensified with frightening speed, transforming from heavy rain into a deluge that turned the ranch yard into a muddy torrent. Cole and Ayesha worked frantically to secure everything before the worst hit. They moved the cattle to higher ground, reinforced the barn doors against the violent wind, and hauled equipment under cover. By the time they'd finished, both were soaked through, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Thunder crashed so loudly it seemed to shake the ground, and lightning turned the black sky into brief daylight with each strike. Cole knew from experience that storms like this could last hours, and the real danger would come after. Flash floods that turned dry arroyos into deadly rivers. He needed to check the cattle in the far pasture, where a narrow canyon could trap them if water levels rose too quickly. Ayesha insisted on coming, knowing the terrain well enough to help navigate in the storm. They rode out together into the driving rain, visibility reduced to almost nothing. The cattle were exactly where Cole feared, clustered nervously in a canyon as water began flowing through the rocky channel. They managed to drive the frightened animals to higher ground, working in perfect coordination despite the chaos of wind, rain, and panicking livestock. By the time they'd secured the cattle safely, the storm had intensified further and night had fallen completely. Visibility was zero. The ground had turned treacherous with mud and rushing water, and both riders were exhausted and shivering despite the warm temperature. Cole made a quick decision. There was a line cabin about a mile north, maintained for exactly these emergencies. Attempting to ride back to the main ranch in these conditions risked serious injury or worse. They headed for the cabin, moving carefully through the storm-ravaged landscape. The line cabin was small but solid, built to withstand harsh weather. Cole lit the oil lamp while Ayesha secured their horses in the small attached shelter. The single room contained basic necessities: a wood stove, bunks, emergency supplies, and blankets. Cole got a fire going in the stove while Ayesha found dry blankets. Both were soaked, cold despite the summer heat, and exhausted from hours of hard work in dangerous conditions. Cole and Ayesha sat on opposite sides of the small cabin, wrapped in blankets, as their wet clothes dried near the stove. The storm raged outside, wind howling and rain hammering the roof in waves. They were trapped there until morning at minimum, possibly longer if the storm continued. The situation was awkward but unavoidable. Two people of different genders, different backgrounds, alone overnight in close quarters. Both understood the potential for gossip if anyone learned of this, but survival had taken precedence over propriety. As the night stretched on, and the storm showed no signs of stopping, they talked in quiet voices to pass the time and distract from the cold and discomfort. Cole asked about Ayesha's childhood before the mission school. She described growing up in Apache camps, learning from her grandmother about plants, tracking, and reading the land. She spoke of losing her family during conflicts she was too young to fully understand, being taken to the mission school where nuns taught her English, Christianity, and domestic skills meant to civilize her. She described the confusion of being told her own culture was wrong, her language forbidden, her beliefs primitive. When released at 18, she'd found herself belonging nowhere, too Apache for white society, too assimilated for Apache communities that viewed her with suspicion. Cole listened without judgment, then shared his own story of arriving in Texas at 20 with nothing but ambition and stubbornness. He'd worked other men's ranches for years before saving enough to buy his own land. He'd been married briefly, but his wife had left after 2 years, unable to tolerate the isolation and hardship of ranch life. He'd spent the last decade building something sustainable alone, never quite fitting into town's social circles, but earning respect through hard work and fair dealing. They found unexpected common ground in their shared experience of existing somewhat outside the communities they lived among. By the time the storm began to ease near dawn, Cole and Ayasha had developed a deeper understanding of each other as individuals, rather than simply employer and worker. As grey light filtered through the cabin's small window, they prepared to ride back to the ranch, both aware that their absence overnight would need careful handling if anyone asked questions. They rode back to the ranch in the early morning, the landscape transformed by the storm. Arroyos ran high with muddy water, debris scattered across the range, and the air smelled of wet earth and damaged vegetation. Both were tired but relieved to find the main ranch buildings intact. Cole suggested they resume normal work routines, and neither spoke about the night in the cabin beyond acknowledging they'd made the right decision seeking shelter. For 2 days, everything seemed normal. Then Marcus Webb, Cole's nearest neighbor, rode over ostensibly to check on storm damage. Webb was a prosperous rancher whose opinion carried weight in the small community of isolated homesteaders. He made small talk about the storm before mentioning casually that he'd ridden by Cole's ranch the morning after the storm and noticed both Cole and his Apache worker had been absent. The horses and barn had been secured, but nobody had been home. Webb's tone was carefully neutral, but his implication was clear. Cole felt his stomach tighten, but answered honestly. They'd been caught in the storm while moving cattle and had sheltered in the line cabin overnight. Webb nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he'd expected exactly that answer. He made a comment about how unfortunate it was that circumstances had forced such an arrangement, and how people in town might misunderstand the situation if word got around. The threat beneath the polite words was unmistakable. Gossip was already spreading. After Webb left, Cole found Ayasha repairing tack in the barn. He told her about Webb's visit and the implied gossip. Ayasha's face remained carefully neutral, but Cole saw tension in her shoulders. She asked what Cole planned to say if questioned further. Cole said he'd tell the truth. They'd been working during the storm, sought emergency shelter, and nothing inappropriate had occurred. Ayasha was quiet for a long moment before speaking carefully. She explained that the truth wouldn't matter. In both Apache and white communities, a woman alone with a man overnight was assumed to be shameful regardless of circumstances. If Cole defended her openly, it would only confirm that something worth defending had occurred. The best strategy was silence, letting the gossip eventually fade without confirmation. Cole disagreed, arguing that allowing false assumptions to stand was wrong, that speaking truth was important. Ayasha's response was firm. His truth would shame her in ways he couldn't understand. Despite Ayasha's warning, Cole believed that honesty would resolve the situation. When he rode into town the following week for supplies, several townspeople made pointed comments about his interesting hiring choices and unusual arrangements. At the general store, the owner's wife asked with false sweetness whether Cole's Apache worker was managing adequately despite difficult circumstances. Cole responded directly, explaining that Ayasha was an excellent worker, that they'd been caught in the storm while protecting livestock, and that they'd made the sensible decision to shelter safely rather than risk dangerous travel. He stated clearly that nothing inappropriate had occurred, and anyone suggesting otherwise was engaging in harmful gossip. The store fell silent. Cole paid for his supplies and left, satisfied he'd defended both their honors. He didn't see the exchanged glances behind him. The knowing smiles that suggested his vehement defense only confirmed suspicions. When Ayasha rode into town later that week to pick up supplies Cole had ordered, she encountered a noticeably colder reception than before. Women who'd previously treated her with polite distance now openly avoided her. Men made comments just loud enough for her to hear about those kinds of women and what can you expect. At the general store, the owner informed her tersely that he no longer extended credit to unreliable customers and demanded immediate payment. Ayasha paid without argument and left quickly, feeling the weight of judgment following her. When she returned to the ranch, she confronted Cole directly. She explained that his public defense had made everything worse, that he'd confirmed the gossip rather than dispelling it. In trying to protect her reputation, he'd actually destroyed it. Now she was marked in everyone's eyes as a woman who'd been alone with a man overnight. Whether anything happened didn't matter. The stain on her character was permanent in their view. Cole was stunned. He'd done what he thought was right, spoken truth against falsehood. How could that have made things worse? Ayasha tried to explain the complexity of her position, caught between cultures with different but equally harsh judgments about women's behavior. By speaking publicly about their night together, even in defense, Cole had made it a confirmed scandal rather than unverified rumor. Cole argued that letting lies stand was cowardice. Ayasha replied that sometimes survival required choosing battles carefully, knowing when speaking would help versus when silence was wiser. The gossip intensified rather than fading. Stories circulated about Cole and Ayasha, each retelling adding details until the simple truth of seeking storm shelter became something scandalous. Some versions suggested Cole had taken advantage of his position as employer. Others claimed Ayasha had seduced him for better treatment. An unmatched reality, but reality had ceased to matter in the face of compelling narrative. Cole began noticing social consequences. Ranchers who'd previously been cordial now avoided him at the cattle auctions. The bank became less accommodating about his accounts. The town doctor's wife organized a church social and pointedly didn't invite him, a snub that signaled his reduced standing. For Ayasha, consequences were more severe. The few Apache families in the area who'd maintained polite neutrality toward her now shunned her completely, viewing her as having confirmed their suspicions that she'd compromised herself by working for white ranchers. The Mexican families who operated small farms nearby, who'd sometimes traded goods with her, now refused her business. She existed in even more profound isolation than before. One afternoon, a delegation of 3 ranchers rode to Cole's property. They were led by Marcus Webb and included 2 other established landowners. Webb spoke for the group, explaining with false regret that Cole's situation was creating problems for everyone. His relationship with his Apache worker had become a scandal that reflected poorly on all ranchers in the area. They strongly suggested he dismiss Ayasha and hire someone more appropriate, meaning white and male. Cole refused flatly. Ayasha was an excellent worker who'd done nothing wrong. He wouldn't punish her for gossip and prejudice. The ranchers left with barely concealed anger, warning that Cole was making choices that would have lasting consequences for his business relationships. After they departed, Ayasha told Cole she'd decided to leave. Staying was causing him too many problems, and her presence would only make things worse. Cole argued against it, saying that would be letting the gossips win, giving in to unjust pressure. Ayasha responded that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about surviving with whatever dignity remained possible. Cole had tried to do the right thing, but had failed to understand that his version of honor didn't translate across cultural boundaries. That evening, Cole and Ayasha had the most honest conversation of their acquaintance. Cole admitted he'd been wrong to ignore her initial plea for silence, that he'd prioritized his own sense of what was right over her understanding of her situation. He'd believed that truth and directness would resolve things, not recognizing that social dynamics were more complex than simple honesty. Ayasha explained patiently what Cole had failed to grasp. As an Apache woman working for a white rancher, she occupied a position of profound vulnerability. Everything she did was scrutinized through layers of prejudice and assumption. Any hint of impropriety, real or imagined, would be used to confirm existing beliefs about Apache women, about her character, about appropriate social boundaries. By publicly defending what happened, Cole had drawn attention to something that might have remained unconfirmed rumor. His passionate defense had been interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. She explained that in Apache culture, shame wasn't just personal, it reflected on family and community. Although she'd been separated from her people, she still carried those values. Being publicly discussed as a woman of questionable virtue, even falsely, created shame she couldn't easily remove. In white society, a woman's reputation once damaged was nearly impossible to restore. She'd asked him to stay silent, not because she was ashamed of the truth, but because she understood that speaking the truth would create shame, regardless of facts. Cole struggled to accept this, his sense of justice rebelling against the idea that truth could be harmful. But he was beginning to understand that his privileged position as a white male rancher meant he didn't face the same consequences for scandal that Ayasha did. His reputation had suffered, but he still owned his land, still had his business, still had options. Ayasha had nothing but her labor and whatever fragile acceptance she could maintain. They discussed what to do next. Ayasha insisted leaving was the only solution, for both their sakes. If she left, the gossip would eventually fade, and Cole could rebuild his standing. If she stayed, the situation would only deteriorate further. Cole asked where she would go. Ayasha admitted she didn't know. There were few places that would hire an Apache woman, fewer still where she'd be treated fairly. Before they could resolve anything, the situation escalated beyond their control. A group of townspeople, led by the minister's wife and supported by several prominent ranchers' wives, organized a formal complaint to the sheriff about immoral conduct on Cole's ranch. The complaint didn't accuse specific illegal activity, but demanded investigation of what they termed inappropriate cohabitation between Cole and Ayasha. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode out to Cole's ranch reluctantly. He'd known Cole for years and found the whole situation distasteful, but community pressure had forced his hand. He interviewed both Cole and Ayasha separately, asking direct questions about their living arrangements and what had occurred during the storm. Both told the truth exactly as it had happened. Bradley believed them, but explained that belief wasn't enough. The community wanted action, wanted visible consequences for perceived transgression. He suggested strongly that Ayasha should leave the area for her own safety and Cole's peace. When pressed about what safety meant, Bradley admitted there were people making threats about teaching that Apache woman a lesson if the situation continued. After Bradley left, Cole was furious. He wanted to confront the people making threats, to demand they face him directly instead of hiding behind moral outrage. Ayasha stopped him, explaining that confrontation would only make things more dangerous. She'd experienced this pattern before, righteous anger from people who needed someone to judge, to feel superior to punish. Nothing Cole said or did would change their minds because this wasn't really about truth. It was about maintaining social hierarchies and punishing those who didn't know their place. That night, Ayasha packed her few belongings. She told Cole she'd leave at dawn, heading south toward Mexico, where Apache people still lived with somewhat less restriction. Cole offered money, supplies, anything that would help. Ayasha accepted the supplies, but refused extra money, saying she'd earned her wages fairly and wanted nothing that could be construed as payment for anything else. As they talked through the evening, Cole finally understood the full dimension of what his honorable defense had cost her. He'd meant to protect her, but had instead exposed her to worse judgment. His good intentions had caused real harm. Just before dawn, as Ayesha prepared to leave, an unexpected visitor arrived. Maria Santos, an elderly Mexican woman who operated a small farm 5 miles from Cole's ranch, rode up with 2 of her adult sons. Maria spoke directly to Ayesha in Spanish, which Ayesha understood from her mission school years. Maria explained that she'd watched the situation unfold with disgust. She'd seen good people destroyed by gossip and righteous judgment too many times. She was offering Ayesha work on her farm, where she'd be surrounded by family and protected from harassment. The work would be hard and the pay modest, but she'd be safe. Cole was surprised but grateful. Maria turned to him with less warmth, explaining in careful English that she respected his intentions but questioned his judgment. A man who didn't understand the consequences his actions would have on someone vulnerable should learn to listen before acting. Cole accepted the criticism, acknowledging he'd been wrong to ignore Ayesha's initial warning. Maria nodded approvingly at his willingness to admit fault. She said that showed more character than his original prideful defense. As Ayesha prepared to leave with Maria's family, she and Cole had a final conversation. Ayesha thanked him for treating her fairly, for seeing her as a capable worker rather than just her background. She acknowledged that his intentions had been good even when his actions weren't wise. Cole apologized genuinely for the harm his defense had caused, admitting he'd let his own pride and sense of justice override her lived experience and knowledge. Over the following months, the scandal gradually faded as people found new topics for gossip. Cole's business relationships slowly recovered, though some neighbors never quite forgave him for defending that Apache woman so publicly. He learned to be more cautious about town social dynamics, more aware of how his actions as a privileged landowner affected those with less power. He visited Maria's farm occasionally to check on Ayesha, maintaining respectful distance but ensuring she was managing well. Ayesha thrived in her new position, working for Maria's extended family and gradually becoming accepted in the small Mexican community that proved more tolerant than either the Anglo or Apache communities had been. A year after the scandal, Cole attended a community meeting about water rights, where multiple ranchers gathered to negotiate shared access to limited resources. Marcus Webb stood to make his case for priority access based on his larger operation. He spoke confidently until Maria Santos, now a respected voice in the agricultural community, challenged his calculations. She pointed out errors in his water usage projections and suggested a more equitable distribution system. Her proposal was so clearly superior that even Webb couldn't effectively argue against it. After the meeting, several ranchers approached Maria, asking where she'd learned such sophisticated resource management. Maria smiled and said she'd had good help from a young woman who understood land and water with exceptional skill. When pressed, she acknowledged that Ayesha had contributed significantly to her farm's improved productivity and had taught her much about sustainable practices. Some of the ranchers who'd condemned Ayesha a year earlier now looked uncomfortable. Cole watched this exchange with mixed feelings, satisfaction that Ayesha's capabilities were being recognized, but frustration that it had taken this long and had required Maria's endorsement rather than his own defense. That evening, Cole received an unexpected visit from Sheriff Bradley. The sheriff explained that he'd been thinking about the previous year's scandal, about how eager everyone had been to assume the worst and how quick to judge. Bradley admitted he'd pressured Cole unnecessarily, letting community prejudice override his own judgment. Cole appreciated the apology, but said the person who deserved it was Ayesha, not him. Several weeks later, the minister's wife organized a church fundraiser for a new school building. To everyone's surprise, Maria Santos attended and brought Ayesha as her guest. The room fell silent when they entered. Maria walked directly to the front, made a generous donation, and announced that her farm would provide supplies for the school at reduced cost. She added pointedly that Christian charity should extend to judging others more generously and recognizing worth in people regardless of background. Ayesha said nothing, standing with quiet dignity while people who'd condemned her looked away uncomfortably. The minister, to his credit, stepped forward and thanked Maria for her generosity and welcome back to church functions. The moment passed without confrontation, but something had shifted in the community's consciousness. 2 years after the initial scandal, Cole and Ayesha had both found their places in the borderland community, though in ways neither had expected. Cole's ranch prospered through hard work and careful management. He'd learned to navigate town politics more carefully, understanding that being right wasn't always the same as being effective. He'd gained respect for recognizing his mistakes and not repeating them. Ayesha continued working for Maria's family, eventually becoming a partner in the farming operation. She'd found a community that valued her skills and accepted her complex identity, not fully Apache, not fully assimilated, but uniquely herself. She maintained cordial but distant relations with the Apache communities in the area, accepted by some for her practical contributions, even if never fully welcomed. One autumn afternoon, Cole rode to Maria's farm to discuss purchasing hay for his winter cattle feed. He and Ayesha talked while reviewing the harvest, their conversation professional but warm with genuine mutual respect. Cole mentioned he'd been thinking about their shared history, about how his attempt to defend her honor had actually caused her shame. He'd believed doing the right thing meant speaking truth regardless of consequences, but he'd learned that consequences mattered, that good intentions weren't enough, that listening to people about their own experiences was more important than imposing his own values. Ayesha acknowledged his growth, saying that his willingness to learn from mistakes showed real character. She explained that she no longer carried shame about what had happened. Time and Maria's family's acceptance had helped her realize that other people's judgments didn't define her worth. She'd learned to distinguish between actual wrongdoing and failing to meet others' expectations. As Cole prepared to leave, Ayesha said something that stayed with him. "You wanted to protect my honor by ignoring my voice. You learned that real honor means respecting someone enough to listen, even when you disagree." Cole rode back to his ranch, thinking about the complex lessons of the past 2 years. He'd learned that justice was more complicated than simply telling truth, that privilege meant his actions had different consequences than the same actions would for others, that good intentions required wisdom to become good actions. The borderland remained harsh, the social dynamics remained complex, but both he and Ayesha had found ways to navigate them with hard-won understanding.